Hey guys, I want to thank you for joining with us today. I'm out here at Masterson Station Park, which is right next to my house, so it's a convenient place to come. But I'm really trying to take advantage of the last little bit of fall color that we're having before the leaves are all gone, and it just looks bare. Kentucky is a beautiful place to live about 8 months out of the year. But these next 4 months are going to be that time frame that it's not nearly as pretty. But I appreciate you joining with us today because this is a story that I've been digging into it. It's really interesting in the last little bit of this story how we see what it might be like to worship a God that you have to lie and use deceit to defend. So stick with us while we look at the beginning of the trial of Stephen and what we might learn about the people and their perception of God from what they do. So stay with us. So in our story, up to this point, the deacons have been appointed. There's 7 of them because the Jewish widows were not being, the Gentile widows were not being taken care of, while the Jewish widows were, and it caused a fight in the early church, essentially. And I love the fact that God shows us in His Word warts and all of His people. He doesn't gloss over anything. And one of the men chosen was Stephen, and he has a Gentile name, right? Which is all 7 of these men chosen to be deacons had these high standards of spirituality, and yet what they were going to be doing was serving tables. But as we see from at least 2 of these guys, God did really extraordinary things with them. Here, Stephen was doing great signs and wonders among the people, and there were some members of the synagogue of the freedmen who they were up in arms. They just couldn't stand it. And so they tried arguing with Stephen, and that did not go well at all because he had wisdom and the Holy Spirit on his side. And just basically from what the little bit of scripture we see here pertaining to that, he essentially just shut them down, which leads us to our story today. And so some of those folks from the synagogue of the freedmen, they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard Stephen speaking blasphemies against God and against Moses." And they stirred up the people and the scribes and the elders to where they came and they took Stephen and took him before the Sanhedrin. And then some men gave false testimony and said, "We have continually heard him speak against this holy place, the temple, and against the law. We heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth is going to destroy this place, and he's going to change the customs that were handed down to us from Moses." Those that were sitting in the Sanhedrin, as they looked intently at Stephen's face, his face looked like the face of an angel. And there's our story from God's Word. So, I'm curious, what do you think it might have been like to have been these guys? We've talked about this in several previous stories, but I think it's important to really set the emotional stage for some of these events. What do you think it might have been like to be these men who have been in religious and essentially, because religion and politics were pretty much tied hand in hand. They had been in both religious and political power for a long time. And now suddenly you had these people with no training, no religious pedigree coming, and not only were they not in full agreement with what you were teaching, but as you tried to make a stand against them, they just made you look silly over and over and over again. What do you think these religious leaders, steeped in tradition and hierarchy, what do you think they might have been feeling? Obviously, I think one of the things we see in these stories is anger, but I wonder, do you think anger can oftentimes come from frustration? I mean, do you see these guys just being really like, they they don't know what to do. There's no options for them. Well, let's look into this story a little bit. So they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard him blaspheme against God and against Moses." I wonder. First of all, it strikes me in this part of the story, how do you blaspheme a man? Right? How do you blaspheme Moses? Does this tell us anything about these Jews? Do we learn anything about where they had placed Moses on the religious scale here? I mean, does it seem like maybe they had elevated a man to a position greater than God intended for him to be elevated? Yeah, kind of interesting there. And I wonder, what do we learn about their God from the fact that their men had to be secretly persuaded to say something in defense? We're going to look at this a little bit more in more detail as we get along to the next part of the story here. But I mean, does that tell us anything about the God they believed in? And this is the God of the Bible we're talking about, right? But if you have to secretly persuade somebody to say something that's not true, is that the God of the Bible that's being defended? Or rather, is it a God of your imagination? Well, and we see the effectiveness of what these people said, because it stirred up the scribes and the elders and the people, and they came and they grabbed Stephen and took him before the Sanhedrin. And then some false witnesses testified, "We have continually heard him speak against this holy place, the temple, and the law. And we heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth is going to come and destroy this place and change the customs that had been handed down to us from Moses." So again, what do we learn about the God that they're worshiping, that it takes false testimony to defend him? I mean, if someone has a God that you have to lie or use deceit to defend, what might that tell us about that God? Would a real God of the universe need people to do ungodly things to defend him? Well, I wonder what we might learn about these people and their faith. Would you say they had faith, or would you say they had religion? And if they did have faith, what was their faith in? It seems like their faith was in their religious system, right? Rather than a real personal living God. But there were men that gave false testimony what they said was, "We have continually heard him say." He spoke against this holy place, the temple. I mean, if the God you're worshiping is all about a place, I mean, what might you learn about the God or what they thought of God from the fact that he was so deeply entrenched, not just in Jerusalem, but in the temple at Jerusalem. I mean, what do you see there? Yeah, if I've got a God that can only live within a, several 100-yard or however large it was, and you can't even speak against that, my goodness gracious, or to speak against the law. It's interesting because earlier on, Jesus said, I've not come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. So, does it seem like it was the law they were worried about defending, or their interpretation of the law? Do you think it was simply a matter of Stephen saying, well, here's, in whatever he was preaching, we don't have a record yet. He's going to preach a sermon here in just a little bit. But as he was doing these things and as he was teaching, obviously he was dealing with some things. Do you think it was a matter simply of his take on what God said was different than their understanding of what God said? I wonder what we might learn about these guys, that they were so secure in their belief that they were willing to put a man on trial simply for not agreeing with every jot and tittle, every little detail of their belief system. What might we learn about them and their belief system, right? And then these false witnesses go on to say, this Jesus of Nazareth has said he's going to destroy this temple. And change the customs that were handed down to us from Moses. So does this tell us a little bit about their belief system, a little bit more about their belief system, how it was tied into the temple? And also, does it seem like the law had been elevated to a place that essentially at this point we're going to see is pretty dangerous? What's another word when you hear customs? What's another word you think of? For me, I think traditions. I look around and we all have traditions, right? Every church, every belief system has its customs and traditions. And even the way we do those traditions is different very often than what was done before. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. So they're making all these false accusations, and then in the midst of that, as they bring, as he's standing there before the Sanhedrin, and at this point, Stephen hasn't even begun to defend himself yet. But as these that are sitting there waiting to judge, as they're looking at Stephen, his face, it's kind of interesting that as I'm doing this, the sun is shining right through this tree on my face. That is not a holy glow. But it's interesting that God chose to do something here that is relatively unique. I should have said in the introduction, way back in Exodus, Moses, when he spent time with God, when he would come down off the mountain, his face was glowing, and it upset the people so much they made him put a cloth over his face to cover it up, because they couldn't stand the reflected glory of God, right? But I wonder what we might learn about God from the fact that he allowed Stephen's face to shine like this, even before this trial. Does it seem like he's trying to communicate to the very people that are getting ready to accuse his servant? Might that tell us anything about his heart as far as wanting these people to understand who he really was? Do you see him trying to communicate through allowing Stephen's face to do what Moses' face had done, several thousand years before? Yeah, and it's and the fact that they were looking intently. Does this seem like they, it's like, whoa. How could they have responded here? Yeah, like, okay, what brought that about? What's causing that? maybe we need to back up a little bit here and reconsider some of what we're saying and doing. But as we're going to see later on in the story, they didn't do that. In the story, we saw that these guys had to go about using deceit and trickery, lies, ungodly methods to defend the very God that they're saying they're worshiping and protecting. Today, does that still happen? Do people still use ungodly means to try to protect God's image or protect what people believe about God? I mean, what could that look like? I think of some of the places I go, and you can't speak anything against what the normative teaching is, or if you say anything against this, that's a crime, right? But I wonder, do we do some of the same things? Can you think of a time in your life when maybe you went about defending God in a way that maybe wasn't so godly? I think of the way we've treated people who might not, who might be living in sin. Like the homosexual community. I realize there are going to be some of you that disagree with this, but Scripture is fairly clear that homosexuality is not God's not God's intent for people. And yet the church has been very guilty of, it's one thing to disagree with somebody, it's another to do harm to them. And I think and there's some things like that. When it comes to racism, I'm not, and goodness gracious, you can't even mention something anymore, all of a sudden you're labeled something. I am an old school kind of guy. But there has been racism. There's currently racism, and one of the things I'm always surprised about is that nobody's talking about how the Latino community is being treated, right? But there are issues in the church that we have, we spent a lot of energy defending some stances that may not have been defensible, right? How do we do those things in love? How do we trust God to judge with some of that stuff? This story reminds me of back in the day. I was actually had a conversation with somebody about this the other day, which I guess is what reminds me. When I was early in seminary, Ronald Reagan was running for his second term of office, and we were part of the moral majority. We just knew that we were going to change the moral face of the country through politics. And Ronald Reagan is one of my favorite presidents. I love that guy. And I think he did a lot of things really well. However, that promise that we had thought was, the changes that we thought were going to come about, it didn't happen. Because the reality is you're not going to make spiritual changes through politics. It can really cause you problems. And so I would say, for all of us, we need to examine our heart. This has been a time of examination for me, because there's a lot of things. I'm an old coot, right? I'm of a totally different generation than a lot of you younger folks. And I've seen some things over the years, and I recognize there's some things that we did poorly. There's also some things we did pretty well. And there we go again. I'm about to use an expression that carries a certain weight for a whole population of people that I don't want to offend, that I love, right? And so I have to change. I have to learn to change my language and expressions that I've used from childhood as a Southern-born, Southern-bred kid. But I would challenge us. What in this story could help us to live differently? And I think the self-examination of, okay, as I'm defending these positions, as I'm defending doctrine, as I'm defending certain beliefs that I have that I believe are very scriptural. However, I can do that in the wrong way. And so I need to guard my heart, right? There was a time, I meet with a group of pastors each week, and been meeting with them now for about 16 or 17 years. And there was a time 35 years ago, I wouldn't have met with most of these guys, because doctrinally they're at a different place than I would be. And there's some things that we don't agree on as far as spiritual gifts and some of those things. At one time, that would have been my measuring tape as to whether I was going to have any fellowship with them or not. And man, I mean, these are some of my best friends. I love these guys. I look forward to being with them. I trust what the Lord says to and through them. And I trust that as I bring things to them, they're honestly going to seek God's face and pray for me, right? What I would have missed out on if I had continued to have those small box beliefs that I had at one time, that would have limited me from hanging out with them at all. And I just want to challenge you. Sometimes we can have the right beliefs and put them in action in the wrong way. And just, I think all of us probably need to search our hearts and see, are we, what kind of stands are we taking for the Lord? Are we defending him in a godly way, or in a way that brings dishonor to him? I would love to hear some of your comments on this, and and I realize I'm walking on a minefield here, because this is so many trigger words part of this. But I think it's time that as God's children, we have to sit back and say, okay, let's talk about some of this stuff. Let's have a dialogue. It's okay for people to examine what they believe, and it's okay for somebody to question somebody about what they believe. That's a good thing, right? Because if our belief won't stand up to scrutiny, it's not a biblical faith. It's just wishful thinking. If you've not subscribed to the channel, love to have you do so. Love to have your comments down in the comments section. But until the next time, keep on telling those Bible stories.